Cool. All right, so today I will be doing July's opening lab. We got some questions in from Patreon, from subscribers at the $15 tier. And yeah, I think we have 3 questions. But, if you guys are watching, you see something interesting, you're, of course, welcome to ask follow-up questions. And, during our stream, we're always answering questions anyway. So if you don't get a chance to ask your question, you can always, David will be streaming after me a little bit later today in a couple hours, and then we'll be doing Sunday night fights. And during Sunday night fights, we're always open to questions. So I feel like we don't gotta be too let's say careful about it. Questions will be answered one way or another. So yeah, I've got the first question I'll be looking at up here from Jason Jasonson. Let me switch to my analysis board. Okay, so Jason is asking, could you please cover the Grunfeld? Maybe these lines after bishop g5, or some books recommend black doesn't play knight e4. White wins the pawn, but black is supposed to be fine. I think I know what you're talking about. Also, could you cover some closed Sicilian plans for black with a fianchettoed bishop on g7? Okay, yeah, kind of totally different. So 2-word question, one on the Grunfeld and one on the closed Sicilian. Absolutely. So let's start with the Grunfeld. I think the bishop g5 lines Jason is referring to are these, where white goes bishop g5. And yeah, from what I know about these lines, they're not the most aggressive, but they can be a little bit tricky for black. Let me actually flip the board. And yeah, I was looking at this a little bit. So, right, the main line for black is often to play knight e4. And just immediately challenge the bishop, offer this kind of structure where black will just get counterplay on the diagonal. As far as I know, theoretically, black is doing fine here. White usually backs the bishop up somewhere, bishop f4, bishop h4. At a certain point, black will take on c3, go c5. You can get a Grunfeld, and white gets chances for a very, very small advantage. But some players, okay, they want to play it with bishop g7. And I think the reason they want to do this is because on knight f3, knight e4 avoids some lines. Right now, knight takes e4, de hits the knight on f3. And I think there are lines in these pawn sacrifice positions, let's say bishop h4. Sometimes black will take this pawn on c4. And I think in some cases it's better that white is already committed to having the knight on f3 versus being able to later develop it to e2. I don't know exactly where white wants to go knight e2, but I feel like that's kind of one of the points as well. Hey, Patient Chess, thanks for subscribing. 5-month streak. That's awesome. That's probably been the whole time that subs have been available. I'm not even sure how many months we've been up and running. So there are some move order benefits to playing bishop g7 here for black. But the one drawback is that it allows this line, I think Jason is talking about, where white wins the pawn with bishop takes f6 and then can take on d5. They can also go knight takes d5, but I think this is not considered super dangerous for black because you just go bishop g7. As far as I remember, and then you're just going to play c6 next, maybe c5, and then the pressure on this diagonal is kind of too much for white. Maybe even e6 is possible somewhere. Yeah, as far as I know, they're basically white usually just goes c takes d5. And then in this position, black has to kind of figure out how to get compensation. So I was looking at this in ChessBase for a little bit, and yeah, it basically feels like the main 2 moves here are going to be c6 and c5 for black. And both moves come with their kind of pros and cons. In general, it feels like black is doing okay theoretically. If you follow, let's say, the latest games, I think that black is basically scoring just fine here. Drawing, winning some games. And I see a lot of players playing this line for black. So specifically, Nepo has had this position quite a bit, and he's played c5 here almost every time. And I feel like when you're studying the opening, and if you know some players that are like really like specialists in your opening, if they're playing the same thing over and over again, it means they really believe in the line. It means like they don't care who's prepping for them, how much they're prepping. They just believe that this is good enough, and they believe in their prep, they believe in their understanding of the opening, and like they make it work. So someone like Nepo is really good for the Grunfeld because he plays the Grunfeld a lot. You know, obviously MVL, Svidler, these are other guys that play the Grunfeld quite a bit. And there's other players too. Artemiev plays the Grunfeld. Yeah, lots of strong grandmasters to follow, especially in the Grunfeld. So easy idea behind c5 is that we're just trying to open everything up. In both cases, whether black goes c5 or c6, I think we're kind of welcoming this line with d takes c6 because this is, I think, known to just be like totally fine for black. Yeah, bishop takes d4 is the line. I think white goes c takes b7. Bishop takes b7, and then basically black is like a pawn down, but has a bunch of compensation. Just with development, when knight f3 comes, black is going to take on c3 and just play against this pawn. And yeah, basically I would imagine black is just at least fine here. So on c6 and c5, white does a couple different things. Like, let's say on c5, white usually goes d takes c5, and then black's idea is to play knight d7. Now black has sacrificed 2 pawns, but is going to be winning the c5 pawn back. And so yeah, typical line might go like e3, castles, knight f3, knight takes c5, knight d4. And I don't think black is going to be winning the second pawn back, so black will just be kind of like a pawn down in this position. But black's idea is that the dark sword bishop just offers like very nice long-term compensation. So this definitely appeals to quite a few Grunfeld players. I see a lot of strong players going for this position. Again, Nepo has like a bunch of games in this line that I would encourage you to check out if you're interested in playing this. So I think this is like perfectly playable for black. Queen is coming out to b6, rook can come to d8 at some point, and basically it's going to be very hard for white to use the extra pawn here. As soon as, you know, whenever you push anything against the two bishops, diagonals start to weaken. It's kind of this like long-term compensation. So this is one option. Second option is to go c6 in this position. And against this, I think white has a couple of moves here, but from what I can tell, the main move seems to be e4. Just kind of supporting the pawn. So e4 against the move c5 would not really be good, right? Because we're hitting the d4 pawn. And here black usually takes on d5. And, well, white can do different things here. They don't really have to take the extra pawn. Seems like the latest trend has been to play bishop b5 check. Then black goes bishop d7, and then white takes. Black can take with the queen. And yeah, apparently black is fine. I mean, again, if knight takes d5, we go bishop to g7, and then the d4 pawn is really difficult for white to defend. So you just kind of remain a pawn down for a little bit, but it seems very likely that with like knight c6 and e6, black should be able to win this one back. Rook d8 coming as well. And there was one game where white played e takes d5 that I found. This was played by Grandmaster Paravian on chess.com, so it's probably like a blitz game like sometime this year, but basically the way this game went was just like castles, knight g2, knight a6. And I think already black was kind of angling to be better here because like there's no way this d-pawn can really survive. Just feels like black is going to have too much pressure. And once black wins this pawn back, basically is just going to be playing against this IQ on d4 in what seems to be just a very favorable scenario where we've already traded off some minor pieces. That's kind of a nice thing when you're playing against the IQP. Yeah, basically I think black is already kind of better here. So this is the danger for white. They might win the pawn temporarily, but then black wins the pawn back and then is strategically better afterwards. Well, white has other options too. I mean, they don't have to take the pawn. They can play like e5 in this position. But as far as I know, black isn't supposed to have huge difficulties in this kind of structure. I mean, the dark square bishop is kind of restricted here, and so your two bishops aren't the most powerful thing in the world, but black has moves. You go castles, knight c6, bishop can come out to like g4 or f5 at some point. You might play on the queen side with rook c8, you might even play f6 at some point. I feel like the position is very much okay for black. Okay. Questions, guys. Questions. I feel like the chat has been silent. Is all this making sense? I know you guys aren't necessarily all Grunfeld players, but if you were, does this seem good? Cool, fair enough. I mean, sometimes a quiet chat means that the stream is going well because everyone is just so engaged with like the content that no one even wants to like type things. Wow, I never saw bishop g5 line. Oh, that's surprising. Are you a Grunfeld player, Dor? I feel like every person like in Israel plays the Grunfeld at some point. It's like, seems like such a common opening. Oh wow, no Grunfeld. That's surprising. I think if you had a team of players from every country, and they had to play the Grunfeld every game, I think Israel would be the top seed. Maybe Russia. Maybe like Russia won still because Russia is so strong, but Israel would be like 2 or 3. Like so many specialists. Rogozin is okay. Personally, I agree with the G Robert. I've always been a King's Indian fan, but the Grunfeld has some very, very specific advantages over the King's Indian. Number 1, it doesn't lose by force, most likely, for being real. The King's Indian probably is going to lose by force at some point once Leela just gets a little bit more understanding of those positions. Grunfeld, yeah, very theoretically solid opening. And doing fine pretty much everywhere. Very hard for white to get an edge against the Grunfeld. Okay, let's go to the second part of Jason's question. Could I cover some closed Sicilian plans for black with the fianchettoed bishop on g7? Yeah, absolutely. Yeah, Mitch, slippery slope for you with the with the Grunfeld. You gotta be careful on that one. All right, let's talk about the closed Sicilian. So usually the way this opening starts is white goes knight c3 on move 2. And when your opponent does this, it should kind of indicate that either they want to play Grand Prix attack with f4 or they want to play closed Sicilian with g3. Now some players are very tricky and they use this as a way to get into the open Sicilian later. So they might even go like knight e2 and then d4. Black takes, knight takes d4. And we have like an open Sicilian. But this trickery, I mean, not a lot of players try this kind of thing because it doesn't really. You got to be able to like take advantage of it with white, and if you're not able to, then it's kind of pointless. From black's point of view, depending on the Sicilian that you play, you got to be kind of careful how you handle knight c3, because if you're a dragon player and you play like d6 and g6, then you can't exactly play e6 in this position, because then white will just play like knight f3 and d4 and get into an open Sicilian, and like you're playing something that's not the dragon. So you have to be kind of careful that you're being, you're like covering your bases, right? Like covering your transpositions. Personally, I've always played like the Taimanov Sicilian. So for me, all these sidelines have been very simple. I just go e6, and I think black is fine. I actually think like if you could just play any move in this position, regardless of your repertoire, I would say the lines with e6 against this stuff are pretty good. Mainly against the Grand Prix attack. I just feel like when white goes f4, black can just like immediately go d5, and I feel like I would already like, I mean, I don't know. I play the French. I I feel like black gets a fantastic French in these positions. So I'm like definitely biased for black's point of view. Okay, but Jason's asking specifically about a fianchetto bishop on g7. So that means that black is going g6 here at some point. I think the move order, whether you go g6 or d6 first, is probably not super important. But yeah, let's say you go g6 and white plays knight e2, bishop g7, and d4. Well, now you have to be ready to play either dragon or accelerated dragon. So hopefully this is part of your repertoire, Jason. Okay. Well, let's say white goes for the typical closed Sicilian with like bishop g2. And they usually start with these exact 5 moves. Because this is everything that's like kind of guaranteed for white in the closed Sicilian. This is kind of the general setup. And then from here, they have some decisions to make, because they can go like f4, knight f3, they can go knight g2, they can go knight h3 in some lines, they can go bishop e3, queen d2 first, which a lot of players often will do against the fianchettoed bishop on g7. And so this kind of forces black to like almost shore our hand first. Although I don't think we're really committed yet. I think black can play like knight c6 in this position, and then ask white, what are you gonna do? Like what kind of setup are you looking for? One move I would say that is not good here is like knight f3. Don't do this, because this is just bad. It's just bad. You're blocking your bishop, you're blocking your f pawn. If you want your knight on f3, you should play f4 first, and then develop your knight behind the pawn, and then that's a beautiful structure. That's, you know, gorgeous. Or if you don't want to play f4, then just play knight g2. Put your knight here, because then it doesn't get in the way. Can jump to f4 and control the d5 square. Basically better for white. And then you can still play f4 in this position if you want, and one day like h3, g4, and then go knight g3 here, from white's point of view. Okay, from black's point of view, the classic plan has always been to just push the b pawn. Just go rook b8 at some point, b5 and b4. Whoops. I wish you could go b5, b3. b5 and b4. This bishop will often come to d7. This knight comes out to f6, castles, and we're trying to basically just put pressure on the queen side. Actually, I should correct. Bishop doesn't always go to d7. A lot of times bishop goes to a6 so that this knight can come back to d7, open up the bishop, and then the knight from d7 can hop to all kinds of squares. There are other ideas for black as well. One big one is to use the d4 square. I think this is a pretty important idea. So one setup that I feel like is maybe underrated a bit, I've always kind of liked, is the setup with like e6 and knight g7. And then the idea is to always just plant this knight on d4 and bring the other knight over to c6. This knight on d4 kind of helps black push b5 because it kind of covers this square. But of course you're going to probably want to play rook b8, b5, b4. And from there, okay, it kind of depends. A lot of players will then even run their a-pawn, a5, a4, a3, and basically black needs to understand that it's all about this bishop. Like you're just trying to do something with this diagonal. Hypothetically, after knight d4, knight takes d4, is cd correct or bishop takes d4? No, good question, raised to GM. Yeah, let's say, for example, like castle here, we play knight e7. It's actually something that doesn't always happen, because what will often happen is white will go bishop e3 and black will put this knight on d4. And then it's hard for white to take this knight, right? Knight takes d4, cd is no good. And then if bishop takes d4, then black definitely goes cd and keeps the dark squared bishop on the board. And in general, with this kind of structure, black's plan kind of, you know, switches, right? We just immediately just start putting heavy pieces on the c file. Just get your 3 pieces on the c file, and you should win the game. White just doesn't have enough space to defend the c2 pawn. But let's say white doesn't develop the bishop. Let's say white plays like h3, for example, and then one day we play knight d4, knight takes d4. Here I think either would be fine actually. My first instinct would be to go bishop takes d4. Assuming like we're not dealing with some bishop h6 unpleasantness, like let's just say we castle here, white goes f4, and we get something like this. Then we go knight d4, knight takes d4. So yeah, you definitely could take cd, and then you have the same plan of just bringing all of your heavy pieces to the c file. I think that would be totally reasonable. But in this case, I feel like bishop takes d4 is also can't be bad for black. Because I guess what's happening is like, you know, white has some kind of short-term chances on the king side, and they're trying to build this attack out of the opening. But black has kind of better long-term chances because this bishop is just so powerful. I mean, it just like puts all this pressure for the whole game, just into the endgame, deep into the endgame. This bishop is going to be annoying for white. And white's bishop on g2 just doesn't have that same power, right? Because it's just blocked by its pawn. And if they ever go e5, then we play d5 and we take over the center. So to me, it totally makes sense to just put the bishop here, play rook b8, let's say knight e2, bring the bishop back, c3, and then just play b5. Because the bishop still exerts tons of pressure on this diagonal. And then again, the follow-up is a5, maybe bishop a6, and yeah, basically just trying to put pressure and not giving white a chance to attack. Hey, Backrank Brawler. Hey, Pawn Wonder. Sombrero. How you guys doing? This is a Closed Sicilian. Yeah, exactly. Can always go f5 to stop white's f5. Yeah, that's an idea maybe we should talk about. In many positions, if black wants to, they can play f5 and just kind of fight back on the king side. I would say wait to do this one until white plays g4. That's kind of like the general, I would say, rule for these positions is like wait for white to play g4, and then if you're really afraid of f5, which I'm not sure we necessarily have to be, but we can play this one in lots of positions. And here, I mean, it's probably a very decent move. And then as a kind of like very general rule of thumb, I hesitate to mention this because I just don't know even how true it is. It's just something I heard from a strong player one time, but I'll share with you guys. There's this kind of like, I feel like it's maybe a half rule in these positions. I don't know how to say it. It's like, it's a thing to think about. You know what? Viewer discretion advised. You do with this information what you want. I am not recommending anything. I'm just saying, as an idea, when white takes one of these, yeah, exactly, race to GM, it's often the case that black wants to probably take back with the opposite pawn, right? Like if g takes f5, we kind of want to go ef. And if e takes f5, we don't always go g takes f5, but it does kind of make sense to go gf as well in this case, because then it's like we're keeping better control over the center. I'm sure there are exceptions to this. It's just like something I heard once, and you know what, if during a game you can't decide, maybe you just go with it. Maybe you just believe in the process. This one definitely makes sense, like taking e takes f5 in this case, because you keep your king protected, you don't give white this like open g file, and yeah, I think black is generally just absolutely fine. This one we got to be careful, because to me, I don't really see what the problem is. Maybe in this case it doesn't even matter. I think either are probably fine. In this exact position, I would encourage black to play bishop b7 very quickly here and just immediately challenge this bishop on the diagonal. And then it's like, look at this bishop on c1, right? It's like, this is the problem with the 4 pawn, that the bishop just doesn't get out, whereas both of our bishops are doing work. But this one's very important. You trade off this bishop, you leave white with big light square weaknesses. Maybe that's the final idea I'll leave with you guys on the Closed Sicilian. If you can somehow trade off this light square bishop, it's often nice. So yeah, in this exact case, I don't even know if I would prefer g takes f5. I think maybe ef5 looks, to me, it looks a lot more solid. But there are probably lots of cases where gf5 is the right move. Mr. Pending says, one possible reason is White's king is more overextended, so recapturing the opposite way leads to more dynamic positions to both sides. Yeah, I think that's pretty fair to say. Yeah, keeping the structure a little bit more dynamic is kind of in Black's favor here, because White is the one with potentially weaker king. Oh, strategic book. Wait, what does SCE stand for? I feel like it's a very familiar acronym. Is it ever dangerous if White plays f5 as a pawn sack, like in the Grand Prix attack? Oh, School of Chess Excellence. Yeah, I was thinking it was familiar. Dvoretsky. Yeah, maybe that's where I read the rule. Maybe I read it in Dvoretsky, because it just sounded very familiar. But it was only brought up to give an exclamation for disregarding the rule. That's funny. Yeah, Dvoretsky's a big believer in concrete analysis and not using rules to kind of like guide your intuition, but always being willing to break the rules. I think very important. Is it ever dangerous if White plays f5 as a pawn sack? It can be, but I don't know. I guess it just depends. With knight on e7, like in this kind of position, I feel like we're often not too concerned about this one. I mean, maybe here we've already traded off a pair of knights. It's really not that dangerous. I'm sure it's dangerous in other situations, but yeah, something that kind of depends on the position. Let's see. Okay, last tip, Jason, I'll give you. So some players, they like to develop bishop e3 and queen d2 against the bishop on g7 because they want to go for a quick bishop h6. So if we play, like, let's say e6 here, queen d2, knight e7, bishop h6. I don't think this is like super dangerous for Black, but it can be kind of annoying because if you castle, their idea is to play like h4, h5 and go for this h-file attack, and this can definitely be very dangerous. You can find yourself getting checkmated here very, very quickly. So be careful about this. At some point, Black probably should play f6 and think about taking on h6, maybe going rook f7. Or if you take on h6 first, queen takes h6, it's just hard to castle, and then this is also kind of unpleasant. So one way that I've learned to deal with this is, instead of developing the knight to e7 right away, I try to come up with other moves that kind of help my position while this knight is covering the h6 square. And this kind of forces White to do something before we develop with knight e7. So for example, we can play bishop d7 here. I think rook b8 is pretty reasonable. I'm pretty sure I had a game where I played just rook b8 in this position, and I think it was absolutely fine. Because you're getting your counterplay going, and White is going to have to kind of show you what they're doing with their king. If they castle kingside, then the h4, h5 stuff is not as dangerous, right? We can just play knight e7. And if they castle queenside, then we kind of know what they're all about, but castling queenside in this position I think is going to be really risky, right? So b5, b4, queen a5, and get the counterplay going. So that's kind of one nuance that might be useful for you guys. Okay, final questions on this before we move on to the next question. Thanks, Rice Farmer, for following. And Derp, ZZZZY. Derpzy, welcome. How do you know when to play queen a5 or a5 for queenside counterplay? I don't have a great answer there. I guess queen a5 is usually useful if you're actually going to take the a2 pawn, or if you have some play against this pin. So I remember one game I played like queen a5 somewhere. I think knight e2 I threw a knight d4, another move you can throw in when the bishop is here, so white isn't really able to take it. And I think maybe white played like h4 here, queen a5, h5, something like that. And my idea was to take on e2 here, because either white has to take and lose a lot of material with bishop takes e3, or they have to take with their king and lose their castling rights, or they have to take with the knight, but then they allow a queen trade, and then b2 like might be hanging at the end. So you can't kind of use these ideas when you're trying to trade queens in the position, which I think usually black is pretty satisfied with a queen trade in these lines, because I think, again, strategically black is doing pretty well. If you don't have any ideas with queen a5 like that are targeting the a2 pawn or something like that, and you're playing b5, b4, and then following up with a5, that kind of makes sense too, because then you're trying to play like a4, a3. So that's the idea. Then of course a5 makes sense. Why can't white take the knight on d4 with the bishop? Well, the dark square bishop is just really important for white. You know, black just takes back, and now this bishop is going to be a strong piece for the rest of the game. I know it looks blocked, but at the same time it's going to be controlling all of the dark squares in the position, and it's going to be a problem for white. Also, this pawn on d4 is kind of a pain in the neck. And actually the last thing is, like, the open c file is often really nice for black, because you can just put your heavy pieces on the c file and eventually target that pawn on c2. Hey Paspon, how's it going? I think your question is coming up, actually. Alright guys, so let's move on to the next question from our opening lab. Next question comes from Laurent. Everyone knows Super GM Laurent Fressinet from Chess24. Sometimes he's a big supporter of the Patreon, and he comes and asks some questions. No, just kidding, just kidding. It's a different Laurent. Oh, how is Geary versus Nepo going? Who's winning that? Nepo won. Wow, nice. Okay, Laurent is asking, do you have a recommendation to play as white against an old Indian setup? Say 1d4, d6, knight f3, knight d7, e4, c6, c4, e5. Let's put that on the board real quick. d4, d6, knight f3. Knight c3, knight f6, bishop e2, bishop e7, the old Indian. So do we have a recommendation to play as white and maybe a model game to start investigating the middle game? White has a couple of slow setups, but it's hard to see what are the pros and cons of each of them. Yeah, good question, Laurent. This is definitely kind of like a very like stodgy opening for d4 players. I mean, e4 players can face this as well, but they're usually not going to be playing c4. It's kind of like a Philidor with white getting a little bit more space with c4. I think I might have some decent recs for you, Laurent. So, I mean, in general, like, these positions are supposed to be just kind of good for white because you just have like more space, and it's like a King's Indian where black gets very little counterplay. It basically just tries to like hold like a solid position. Similar, yeah, kind of like Black Line, but Black Line, I mean, I think is later on tries to be really like aggressive, whereas this line, I think the point is for black usually just to stay put. They want to play like Queen c7, a6, maybe b5, castles, bishop b7, and like just kind of chill and not do anything too crazy. Rook fe8. And admittedly, I think it's a really tough system to crack. I don't think like white just gets an easy advantage and it's like 1-0. But from black's point of view, I don't know. I never enjoy playing these types of positions. I feel like it's really hard to play this from black's point of view as well. So I've never really like worried about it as white. I'm like, okay, one player out of 100 will like play this against me, and I'll try to do something with the space advantage. Maybe it'll work out, maybe it won't. But like, the opening is not really dangerous for white. There's not really a lot of ways that white can just like lose or just get like a terrible position. Vishnu wants to go rook g1 and g4. 52% is not that good though. I mean, it seems like pretty normal normal edge for white. So as far as what I would play, at some point we're gonna want to play d5, but we're in no rush. So I think white should just like safely castle here. Black likely castles, and then yeah, there's different moves you can play, like b3 bishop b2. I think generally is totally fine. I personally kind of like rook e1 and then putting the bishop on f1, because I feel like it gives white some nice protection over the e4 pawn. The bishop is nicely like tucked away on f1. You can play h3 at some point and you'll never have to worry about like bishop takes h3 sacrifices, or if black tries some of these plans with like knight h5, knight f4, you're already kind of equipped to play g3 and you're not really like worried about that. And then at a certain point, white is going to push d5 here. We're not really worried about the structure with e takes d4, knight takes d4, because I think this is just like a very solid... This is a structure you get out of the King's Indian a lot, where black goes e d4 and the bishop is on g7. But here black's bishop is passive on e7, so... And a lot of times what players will do is they'll follow this plan. Well, they'll go bishop f8, g6, bishop g7. It's a King's Indian, but they've lost like a million tempi. So, of course, can't be bad for white if this happens. I think most players here will probably play rook e8 first, or maybe a6. And I think once they go rook e8 and kind of like indicate that maybe they want some kind of pressure against the e-pawn, now is probably a good time to play d5. I think this is kind of the moment. Especially because when we close the center, this is exactly the moment where it becomes more, let's say, logical for black to kind of play for like a King's Indian plan. But with the rook on e8, now they're going to have to like waste the full tempo playing rook f8, and again, it's probably just not in time. From here, we can get different structures. So if they go c5, I would say white should be just much better here. I think this is just a really bad King's Indian for black. And you got a lot of different plans. You can go for a3 and rook b1 and b4. You can put the bishop on g2 and maybe even think about knight h4, knight f5. But ultimately, we're not in any huge rush to win the game here. I mean, black's position is really passive, but it's also really solid. So it's not going to just be like easy to crack. But it's kind of like a risk-free advantage from my point of view. So I don't think this is something we can really worry about with white. It's one of those positions like, this is like a bread and butter position for a d4 player. Big space advantage, your opponent has very little counterplay, and then you can just like slowly press. If you don't feel comfortable playing this kind of position, then it means like, you know, playing d4 might not be what you feel comfortable with in general, because it's like, this is kind of what it's all about, getting some extra space and then trying to like squeeze your opponent. But for like an e4 player, I would say something similar is like a Ruy Lopez. Like if you can't handle a good Ruy Lopez, then it's like you shouldn't be playing e4. Is d takes e5 ever an idea instead of d5? Yeah, usually not. The reason de in these positions, I would say like, you know, this is kind of the heart of the structure. e5 pawn, c6 pawn. So when you go de, you basically just give black more space. Number one, we give them more squares for their pieces. And now we just don't have as much space as before. We don't have this d5 pawn that's like kind of cramping black's position. So all of a sudden black now has access to c5, gives him access to e6. he can try to play knight d4. Whereas once we play d5, there's no way this knight is getting to d4. So it's kind of just like huge improvement for black. I think the King's Gambit is fine. Nothing wrong with the King's Gambit, you know, at heart. I just mean for e4 players, there are some positions that are like fundamental that it's like if they don't feel comfortable playing those positions, then yeah, they gotta learn. So this is the setup I kind of like, and from here, once we go d5, you can play h3, bishop e3, put the bishop here, rook comes to c1, or you can also play b3, bishop b2, and then rook comes to c1 there as well. Or even bishop d2. I think lots of ways to play this position. Now, as far as model games go, so one book I remember had a really nice chapter on the space advantage. I have it here. Is the Gelfand book, Positional Decision Making in Chess. It's hard to see. Okay, you got it. Great book overall. I mean, I imagine Laurent, there's a good chance, has already read this book, because I feel like he's kind of decently well read, and this book has like huge reputation. I mean, it's just like amazing, very well written, really instructive. So maybe he's already read the book, but really nice chapter in here specifically on space advantage that I thought was very instructive. Among other things, it's like also got stuff on like squeezing and what are the chapters in here? Transformation of pawn structure, transformation of advantages, and of course playing in the style of Akiba Rubinstein, classic. But yeah, my favorite was the chapter on the space advantage. I thought that was really useful. And then there's a game here that I thought was really instructive for this kind of structure. I think there's a few games in the structure, if I remember correctly, but the one that I particularly liked is the game Gelfand versus Campora. I'll put it in the chat, but it's in chapter 3 of the book, but you can also look it up if you don't have the book and you just want to see the game. Gelfand Campora. Oh, hey, Laurent. Hey, good to see you. Well, there you go. Yeah, especially his annotations to some of those games, really instructive. 2 more books coming out. Yeah, in September. That's right. I heard that. Now, one of them is like, I think one of them was supposed to be endgame decision making, which sounds great. That's, yeah, that's just gonna be like an insta buy. But then the fourth one is like, oh, you're right, technical decision making. That's the third one, technical decision making. So yeah, instant buy for me. I'm just gonna buy that and read it immediately. And then the fourth one's like heavy piece endgames, and then that one's like. Really? Like, do I really have to buy a whole book for heavy piece endgames? Like, I don't want to do that. Those are like the least interesting kind of endgames. I mean, look, I will happily read a chapter on heavy piece endgames. One lengthy chapter. You know, queen and rook versus queen and rook, or queen and 2 rooks versus queen and 2 rooks. But like a whole book, are you kidding me? You're gonna make me study a whole book on this like one. Now maybe it includes, I'm not sure what the contents are. So, you know, maybe it covers more. Like maybe it's like all rook endgames, queen endgames, and then queen plus rook, queen and 2 rooks. So if it's like a lot, then that's fine. If it's like rook endgames and then queen endgames and then like queen and rook endgames, I'm worried. Like when I first heard the title, I thought it was going to be like queen and rook versus queen and rook and like only these positions. Like 300 pages, just like only queen and rook. It's like, how many? No, but let me clarify. If it covers like rook endgames, I mean, rook endgames is like a massive, like you can do a whole book on just rook endgames, right? And I wouldn't buy it, but I mean, you could do it. But if it's like rook endgames on their own and then queen endgames, I would be fine with that. And then like queen and rook and like queen and two rooks. Yeah, Rice Farmer, I'm pretty sure there would be pawns. That one I think we can safely assume there will be pawns in the book. Yeah, exactly, Race to GM. Yeah, if it covers like the endgames where there's like queen and rooks for both sides, and then also just like individual rook endgames and like individual queen endgames and like two rook endgames, yeah, then that's fine. That to me, that would just be like an endgame book. Like, okay, let's say endgames, but then no minor piece endgames, right? Like, which is fine. And maybe that's kind of the idea, actually. Maybe they're trying to do like a heavy piece endgame, like queen and rooks, and then like a minor piece endgame book. So bishop and knight endgames. That would actually be a very interesting split. Because if you put all of that together, then you just get Dvoretsky's endgame manual. It's like way too much. But if you just split it like minor piece endgames and heavy piece endgames, and then it's like all of bishop and knight endgames, like bishop versus knight, two bishops, opposite color bishops, same color bishops, piece versus pawns, like bishop versus three pawns, and like these kinds of situations, then that's totally fine. They want to do that. Okay, so hopefully, Laurent, that helped. I don't know when you showed up. You might have missed the first part of this when I went through some of the middle games and some of the lines that I would, or some of the ideas that I would use as white here. But you can check out the video on demand. Also, this will go on YouTube later, so you'll be able to rewatch this in its entirety. Minor piece endgames are difficult, yeah. But yeah, what are they gonna do on like rook and bishop versus rook and knight? Is that a heavy piece endgame or a minor piece endgame? That's not clear. Third book, heavy piece plus minor piece. Yeah, there must be another book. Like, what are they? How are they gonna cover that? Oh, maybe that'll be in technical decision making. Who knows? Yeah, Argos. I've heard this book like so many times. The Levenfish and Smyslov book on rook endgames. I feel like it's a book that Dvoretsky probably recommends pretty frequently. But yeah, that might be one to check out just for random people. No one was asking about rook endgames. It's just that it just came up via the Gelfand books. I have dynamic decision making as well, which I've also read and I really enjoyed. I think both of the books so far have been great. I mean, they are advanced, you know, like I wouldn't recommend them for anyone who's like, honestly, like under 2,000. I feel like you guys would have much more effective stuff to be reading. The Gelfand books are pretty deep, you know. I think he's such a strong player, right? So it's hard. It would be hard for them to write a book that's not for like a very high level. So I wouldn't recommend that like everyone reads it. But if you're already kind of like in the expert range, like 2,000 plus, and you're looking for like an interesting read, I think his books are really, really good. Because he does kind of break down a lot of like, it's like he breaks down a lot of like the fundamental stuff, but at a very, very high level. Like, again, how to play with space advantage, how to squeeze your opponent, how to take risks in chess. Like in the second book, it's a lot more dynamic, about like risk taking and what you need to be calculating when you're like going for a sharp position and that kind of thing. Okay, quick question from Fuzzbox. Hey, what's up? What ratio of tactics study / endgame study / playing actual games is worth going for? Right now I'm only playing 1-day daily correspondence and doing tons of tactics. I might play 1 rapid a week or so, but analyze it afterwards. Okay, hey, Amazing Chess, how's it going? Well, Fuzzbox, I mean, what's the goal? Are you trying to play more live chess, like rapid chess, or are you happy to just play more like correspondence and you just want to improve your ability to like analyze the position? So what's the goal? You want to play more live, or are you good with just the daily correspondence stuff? Because I would recommend different things based on the answer. Lightning Speed 900 says they like live chess. Yeah, I know you do. Okay, ideally I want to play more live in OTB. Okay, in that case, there's nothing stopping you. I would say, like, if you're just trying to get better at playing like a full game, like in a half hour, an hour, I would say you need to just start practicing that. Because it's very doable. I'm sure you can do it. It's probably intimidating if you're used to playing like just 1 move per day. Then you have to like make all of your moves all of a sudden. Like, I'm sure it's very intimidating. But basically, that's going to be kind of the main thing you have to practice, is like learning to make your decisions in a set amount of time. A lot of players, they just start out playing with a clock, and they like, it's never an issue for them because they just get used to it right off the bat, right? And they were never in a spot where they could like spend all day on a move and all of a sudden they're like having to be under pressure. So what I would recommend for you specifically is to try to play as long time control as you possibly can. So, because you can play like 45 minutes per side, you can play 90 minutes per side, 2 hours per side. There aren't a lot of players that are willing to play like long time control games, but they are out there, especially if you join our Discord and you use the Discord to find training partners. I'm sure you can find someone who'd be willing to play longer time control games. We also have a ladder tournament where the time control is 45 minutes for each side, and then you get an additional 30 seconds after every move. And that's quite a chunk of time. So I would say start with some kind of longer time control, so you have a ton of time to like just think about what you want to do. Try to move in a reasonable amount of speed. So one thing you're not going to want to do is like, don't just spend all of your time in the opening, because then you're just going to run out of time and lose the game. So you're just going to have to play the best move you can find in the time that you have. And you're just going to have to put your full effort in. And whatever the moves that come out that they are, it doesn't matter. It's fine. You play well, good. You don't play well, it's also fine. The point is just to get that experience, like finishing a full game and feeling like at least you put some effort in and you did your best, and these are the moves that you got, but at least you got them in on time. And I'm sure you're going to win games. It's not like you're just going to lose all your games. Like, at this point, if you're an experienced chess player, I'm sure you'll win games. So I don't think you have a lot to be worried about. Hey, Amazing Chess. I'm actually doing this like opening lab right now where I'm kind of like, we have some questions and I'm like taking more questions. So yeah, not doing a ton of playing right now. It actually reminds me of this thing, Jacob Aggard, who helped Gelfand with his book. He wrote in one of his books that I thought was really interesting. This was from, I think, Thinking Inside the Box. I could get the book and like just read it, but let me just paraphrase. Basically, he talks about how a lot of players, they worry about not performing their best, and they get into time trouble during the game a lot because they're like worried about their moves and they're trying to like calculate everything and they're just spending way too much time. And they're basically being like very indecisive. And he kind of suggests that like, the reason they're being indecisive is that the situation on the board is unclear. It's uncertain. They don't know what's going on and they're trying to figure it out. But the thing is, as he kind of tries to argue, is that things are never going to be certain. You're never going to be able to just fully calculate and figure out a position. It's just like impossible. Like, it's just, the game is too complicated that you'll be able to do this. And what chess players need to do is just trust that if you put in your effort and you think about the position, the moves that you come up with will be decent. Right? If you just put in your effort, think about the position, you will make mistakes. But as long as you do the best that you can in any given moment, you have nothing to fault yourself for. You know, that's kind of your certainty. As long as you do your best during the game, even if you play badly, it's like you still put in your full effort. Like, you thought for 20 minutes, you came up with a move. The move turned out to be garbage, but you still put in your full effort, and then you can learn from it. And next time you think for 20 minutes, your move won't be as bad. Your move will usually be good. But if you're always getting into time trouble because you're indecisive, then your results will always suffer, because, like, no one plays well in time trouble. You're just going to keep, like, blundering stuff. Okay, there are a couple more questions. Let me see if I can scroll up. Someone was asking me about Hans. Yeah, I think Hans Niemann at this point is clearly better than me. I'll just come right out and say it. Better than me at Puzzle Rush, Blitz Chess. I want to say Classical Chess too. I feel like his FIDE is almost certainly higher than mine. So yeah, I think pretty safe. He's a very talented kid. What are you gonna do? What books do I recommend for someone around 2000 USCF? Well, I just mentioned the Gelfand books from Quality Chess. Those are really good. If you haven't read those, might be useful. How about Improving Tactics at Higher Level from GM 2870? Okay, your puzzle rating is 2650, but can't go above 2700 plus. Intermediate tactics are too easy, and tough ones take too much time to find the solution. Well, how much is too much time, GM 2870? What are we talking about? How long before you give up on the problem? Because I think once you get to like 2600 or so, it probably means like that you're probably fine with like simple tactics, right? And you just have to kind of like start developing a little bit more depth. So yeah, I think at your level you can definitely spend like 10 to 20 minutes on one position just trying to calculate and trying to work it out and then seeing how you do. So I would focus more on kind of like the deeper calculation side of things versus like quick, pattern recognition. But yeah, maybe time to get a book, start solving some problems over the board. Woodpecker method's pretty good, I think, for around that level, like pretty advanced, but has some easier stuff too. I'm sure there are other books as well. Hey Matt. Matt asks, what are your thoughts on Emanuel Lasker's Manual of Chess book? Honestly, I haven't read it. I'm sure it's probably fine. I feel like I've heard relatively good things about it. I'm a fan of the book that Capablanca wrote, like Chess Fundamentals. I think that one had some really instructive games. But you could also pick up something a little bit more modern. Like one set of books that I really like are the move by move books, that like ones that are written by Chernev, like Logical Chess Move by Move and then there was one that was called The Most Instructive Games of Chess Ever Played. I like those types of books because every single move in the game is like annotated, and so the author kind of explains the ideas, usually from both sides' perspective, on every single move, and so it has a lot of like really useful comments. I really like John Nunn's book, Understanding Chess Move by Move, but that one might be kind of advanced for like 1000 rating. I would say that one maybe more for players around 1600 or so. But I would say the Chernev books are pretty decent for this level. I also like the Soviet Chess Primer. I'm a big fan of that book. I'll type it in the chat. For basically all levels up to like, I don't know, 1800. It probably has some useful stuff in there. Okay guys, let's move on to the third question from the opening lab. I think this is the final question. Oops, scroll too hard, too far there. All right, question from Ian Lamb. What's the best way for black to meet the Catalan in ChessDojo's view? With white making this move order, please. All right, let's put it on the board. Yeah, absolutely. Amazing Chess, Paspon typed it in the chat if you scroll up. The two Gelfand books. Knight f3, d5, g3. Okay. Yeah, pretty typical move order for the Catalan. Yeah, lots of different lines black can play here. I used to play the Catalan as white. I definitely enjoyed it myself. It worked well for me. It was a fun opening. Because I feel like white's play is always like very clear. It's like you just put the bishop on g2, you castle, this knight comes to e5, knight c3, sometimes knight a3 even, or knight d2, queen c2, play for e4, b3, bishop b2. And white just gets this like long-term pressure on the diagonal with this bishop on g2. But it is a solid opening for black. So from black's point of view, the line you choose here, it kind of depends on like how dynamic you want the position to get. I would say if you're interested in a dynamic position, then from black's point of view, we shouldn't be playing d5 here necessarily. We should be maybe going for something else, like maybe Benoni, for example. But some players do play d5, and then against the Catalan they want something sharp. So there are definitely a couple of good options, but most of the options from black's point of view are more going to be trying to like equalize and be like really solid. So let's see. Ton of options here. I think, what should we recommend? Okay, I would say right now, if you're looking for just like one of the more solid lines, I would go with bishop b4 check. Here, the only move where white can really fight for an advantage is bishop d2. This is kind of the only critical move. And then pull the bishop back to e7. And this line is pretty well known. The idea is like we've induced white to put the bishop on d2, and now they can't get the bishop to b2 so easily. So it's a little bit awkward for white here. And from here, black castles, you go c6, b6, knight bd7, and then bishop comes out, either b7 or a6. And these lines are very, very solid for black. And generally speaking, I don't think black gets many issues here at all. Another line that is also known to be very solid is just the classic bishop e7. I think like black rarely experiences huge problems here. But I don't really like the closed Catalan with c6 and b6. I would encourage you to just take this pawn on c4 and then play a line with like a6, b5, bishop to b7. And I think those lines are pretty solid for black as well. So yeah, if you're comfortable playing a line where your idea is just to try to equalize, then you slowly outplay your opponent from there, I think either of these lines are totally fine. If you're looking for something kind of like sharper, more double-edged, then you probably want to take on c4 and go for one of these lines. And here again, black has a lot of options. There's a6, there's knight c6. I would say like maybe a6 first is kind of the most one of the most dynamic ways black can meet it, that I think is still theoretically like, I think theoretically it's pretty sound for black, is just the positions get sharp, so not everyone wants to do this with black. A lot of players prefer to just kind of play for equality. Finally, someone discussing my favorite opening. Nice, Zenoob. Glad to hear it. Yeah, Catalan is a very interesting opening. Thoughts on going for an early c5 against the Catalan? Yeah, I don't know like a ton about the theory on these lines, but as far as I know, the c5 line has always been really solid. Like, white might have some small chance to fight for an edge here, but yeah, generally speaking, like, black has often been okay in many lines. It's just that you often, like, you'll still get a position that you need to play. So that's kind of the most important thing. Like, whatever line you choose, it's important that you kind of look at it deeper, definitely a lot deeper than, you know, what we're just showing, like, the first few moves here, and like looking at like games from players that like specifically play the system, and then like seeing how it turns out. But yeah, I'm sure there's like tons of lines here that are considered playable. It's just they're all going to lead to some kind of Catalan middle game that we still have to know how to handle, and that's easier said than done. I mean, I would say that's kind of the bigger problem with the Catalan, not so much the theory, but feeling comfortable in the middle games that follow. Now, as far as who to follow as black on these positions, oof, it's hard to say because it's like, I think everyone plays this as black, so it's hard to say like who's this or like a real specialist, because playing d5 is part of the repertoire of like every almost every top player out there. Maybe a couple of guys that could be good is like Kramnik, I bet, has been pretty good from black's point of view in these positions, because he was always a beast from white's side, but from black's point of view, I'm sure he does fine. Carlsen is probably a safe bet, I would say, yeah. Adiban apparently plays this really well, according to Race to GM. I don't know about that, but I'll take your word for it. So yeah, lots of strong players. Maybe Aronian, another one. Anish Giri, Caruana. I mean, I think everyone like probably has had to play this as black at some point. Have I read Romain Edouard's calculation books? I have not, but I've heard good things, and I feel like they would probably be pretty good practice. I think I have a student who's reading one of them, and I think I've seen some of the problems, so they're like I found them pretty good. Ding Liren, actually, yeah, Ding Liren is like the most solid. Oh, but he plays Catalan with white, but I feel like with black, Ding Liren also has some really solid, really solid games too. So Ding Liren could be another player. There was a question earlier. What can I recommend to improve visualization skills? Well, I have a video on my personal YouTube page, if you YouTube me, on visualization that might help, where I suggest some things. But basically, you just have to practice. I mean, and it's actually really easy to practice because all you need is a chessboard and pieces. Like, you can just look at the board in front of us and just start practicing. Just go like, okay, d takes c4. Just come up with random moves. They don't even have to be good. Just visualize random moves. d c4. Put the pawn on c4. Let's say white plays e3. It was white to move in the position. It doesn't even matter. It doesn't even matter. So white goes e3, opening up the bishop on c4, and then just come up with a move for black. Knight c6, whatever. Bishop takes c4. And you just like slowly kind of practice, like, and then are you visualizing? What is the bishop on c4 attacking? Is it hitting f7 or is it hitting e6? Which pawn is it attacking? And you kind of ask yourself questions like, am I actually seeing the position? Am I fully visualizing it? And slowly just kind of work your brain to like slowly improve your visualization. And then you do this during the game. You try to visualize moves. You try to see ahead like, okay, I'm going to play here. What can they do? Can they do anything? Can they do this move? Can they do this move? You just like slowly start working it out. I've also heard good things about the course on Chessable that M. Fabian mentioned, the Visualize course. I think that's a pretty good course for working on your visualization. Yeah, Digit mentions like a good technique to identify all possible captures. And that's something I do myself and with my students. Like if we're working on visualization, if you're trying to figure out like, okay, am I visualizing the position correctly? Just try to see if you can identify every legal capture in the position for both sides. And then go there and like check yourself, right? Think like, okay, in that position, bishop will be able to take here, knight will be able to take here, pawn will be able to take here, blah, blah, blah. And then go there and check and see, did you visualize correctly or no? What will often happen when you're calculating something and visualizing, if you're not visualizing correctly, a lot of times you can kind of catch yourself. Like let's say we're trying to calculate during a game, we're seeing some combination, we're visualizing something. If you then ask yourself, okay, what are all the captures in that final position that I'm getting? A lot of times if you were hallucinating something or like you mess something up or you put a piece on a square that it wasn't, or like a piece was captured and then you're using it later in the variation, a lot of times you'll catch yourself doing these mistakes because like your brain will kind of short circuit. You're like, okay, what are my captures here? And then you'll start thinking and then you'll realize like your visualization is actually kind of fuzzy. And once you realize your visualization has been fuzzy, then you have to go back and redo your work. But then at least you might be able to avoid making a blunder. I don't know. Is this making sense, guys? I feel like I'm just just rambling. Okay, other lines black can play. Thanks, backrank brother. Other lines black can play in the Catalan include. One line I used to play is taking on c4 here, bishop g2, and then going bishop b4 check in this position. And if you're looking for lines that are like solid, but might like, your opponent might not know them, or like, you're trying to look for something a little bit offbeat, maybe look for one of these lines with taking on c4 and going bishop b4 check. Here where white goes bishop d2, a5 is a move that I think is very much playable. And I used to play c5, which is also kind of playable. It gets a little bit funky because it allows white to give you this structure, but black has ways of like making this work. Like this is not quite as bad as it looks at first. Line with knight e5 and knight c6. Yeah, sure. Yeah, so here a6 I would say is one of the main lines. But most Catalan players, they're probably going to know something about this one. But yeah, this is one of the most combative ways black can play. So yeah, how about the line with knight e5 and knight c6? I think we're talking about this line, right? White goes knight e5. Usually they play like queen c2 here, or queen a4, or a4. I think a4 has become kind of the... queen c2, a6, and then a4 has become kind of the main line these days for white. Where black should go like bishop d7, bishop c6. Yeah, this knight e5 line, I don't know. I mean, I remember when I was first learning this, like, it wasn't considered too dangerous because black just goes knight c6 and, apparently equalizes in this position. Like, gets enough counterplay, bishop b7, e5, or c5, and is apparently okay. And then Kramnik started playing this one like several years ago, and I think he showed some really nice stuff. Like he won some good games, and then it became like a major weapon again. But I think it's kind of been worked out to a draw. I don't know. I mean, from white's point of view, you can try this for sure because your opponents probably won't know it too well. And if you know it really deeply and you like the technical kind of chess that you get, then it's definitely like a playable weapon. But if it's not really something I think you can just play like on intuition as white, because then I think black will just kind of equalize and be okay. Yeah, at the end of the main line, white is usually like a pawn up. Yeah, and like a draw a Shen game. Right. As usual. Christopher says they face c5 here more than knight c6. c5 I don't... Oops. c5 I don't know too much about. But it does look like a natural move. So yeah, long story short, I don't think white is supposed to get here a lot, but it could be a good surprise weapon, and yeah, if you feel like your opponent's not going to be prepared here, you can definitely try this and go for like a quick win or something, or at least getting like a really comfortable position. Alright, Ian, hope that helps. So basically, lots of stuff you can do against the Catalan. It's almost all good. It's almost all solid. Just more important to be comfortable with the middle games, and for that I would say check out some of the top guys. Yeah, you can play Catalan type system versus just about everything as well. Yeah, I think the Catalan is pretty flexible setup for white. And if you like this bishop on g2, I mean, why not? It's kind of OP at lower levels, I would say. I would say the Catalan, like, if you were like teaching like a really lower rated student or young student, just preparing them for one tournament, and you give them like some good Catalan prep for like a sub 1000 rated event, it's pretty overpowered. Yeah, it's like the Evans Gambit of d4 openings. Catalan wins the central pawn. Yeah, exactly. Exactly. Omega lol. Funny. Okay, let's see what's going on. We are out of questions. I'm just curious. Oh, here we go. I just want to see who is around. Do Scholastic players even play d4, d5, c4, e6? Yeah, I think, yeah, not everyone takes the pawn on c4. I think when I was a kid, I would just play exactly that. I would just go d5, e6, c6, knight f6, bishop e7, castles, and just get a bad position with the bishop on c8, and then just lose. What I think the best line is for white against the Vienna? I like the pawn sack line, patient chess, you know what I'm talking about? I think, this one. Let black take on e4, castle, take, bishop e7, knight e5. I think these positions aren't very fun for black to play. I think white is pretty happy here. Yeah, I'm sure there was a ton of Carlsen games, because Carlsen played this I think from like probably from both sides. Actually no, mainly from white side lately. But in the past he might have played it as black. But mostly white lately. And yeah, white gets very decent compensation here. You bring the rook to e1, bishop f4, rook a1. Like, theoretically, black is supposed to be kind of holding here, but I think in practice it's difficult for black, because white gets a lot of long-term compensation. It's not the easiest position for white to handle, because you are just going to be down a pawn for a while, but if you're okay with that, then it's a pretty fun position to play, I would say. Alright, let's see what Hans is up to.